Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the first of our autumn sessions of Parliamentary and Scientific Committee discussion meetings. It's great to have so many of you with us. I think the participant number is now well over 100. A few more are dropping in, but it's great to have so many of you joining us as we continue with our online meetings, certainly for the time being. Tonight's discussion is on mathematical modelling and algorithms, something that we have depended upon hugely over the last 18 months and has come to the attention of the public probably more than at any point in history, and has shown the power of mathematics. But at times I suspect it's also shown that mathematics is also based upon probabilities as well, and that's something that we have to try and educate the public a little bit more about. Now, this meeting has been organised in conjunction, or partnership I should say, with the Institute of Mathematics and its applications. And we have a fantastic panel of speakers to inform us this evening. And it gives me great pleasure to warmly welcome Dr. Naira Chamberlain, who is president of the Institute of Mathematics and its applications. Welcome. Dr. Kit Yates, who is senior lecturer at the Department of Mathematics at the University of Bath. Kit, welcome. Dr. Ellen Brooks Pollock, OBE, and I should say that that is a new OBE awarded in the Queen's Birthday Honours List this year, and it's for Ellen's work on modelling during the COVID pandemic. Ellen is Associate Professor at the Bristol Veterinary School at University of Bristol. Ellen, welcome. And finally, we have Professor Hannah Fry from the Centre for Advanced Spatial Analysis, Faculty of the Built Environment at the University College London, UCL. A warm welcome to all of you. In a moment, I'm going to invite each of our speakers to speak for around 10 minutes, and I will try and keep you to time as best I can, but obviously we are very keen to hear what you have to say. With regards to when we get to the question and answer session, after we've heard the 4 presentations, please can I encourage you all to use the chat function within sorry, ignore that, not the chat function. Please use the Q&A function so that we can marshal the questions and work out which ones we're going to get answered. So what I'm trying to say is please don't use chat and don't put your hand up. Please use the Q&A. Otherwise, there's a danger I'll be missing where the questions are coming from. When it is, if your question is selected, and I hope we can get through as many as possible, I will call you by name, you will be unmuted, and then you'll be able to ask your question in person. And when you do that, can you please state the organisation that you are representing? I should say that this session is being recorded, so if anyone has an issue with that, you are now aware. The only other thing I need to probably mention is at times bells might start ringing, certainly at my end. If that is the case, I'm going to have to pass, it means I've got to go and vote. I will have to pass over to Stephen Ben, who is our Vice President, who will take over for the period that I am absent. I think that covers everything, unless anyone indicates otherwise, in which case we'll go to our first presentation, which is from Dr. Naira Chamberlain. Naira, welcome. We look forward to hearing from you for around 10 minutes, if we may.
10 minutes.
Oh.
Hello?
That wasn't a bell, that was a gong. Ignore that.
Okay, we got the screen up. Right. Okay, I'm going to start here. What is the point of mathematical modeling? My name is Dr. Naira Chamberlain, and I'm the president of the IMA. Okay, so in August 2000, there was something called the Kursk disaster. There was a Russian submarine just off the north coast of Russia, and its torpedo actually exploded inside. It said that half the sailors died immediately, but the rest survived for about a whole week, and the world was watching for a whole week where attempts to rescue those sailors went on, but unfortunately, after a week, all of those sailors died. Now, despite a lot of concern from the public, a lot of experts out there says when a situation like this has occurred, a solution is near impossible. My name is Nara Chamberlain, and I'm not only the president of the Institute of Mathematics and its Application, I'm also a professional mathematical modeler, and I've been a professional mathematical modeler for almost nearly 30 years, going around solving real-world problems all around Europe. And so some people say, well, you know, what is mathematical modeling? Now, to me, I like this definition, is to transform any problem into mathematics, solve it, and then apply the solution back into the real world. That's my own personal definition. However, when I'm doing mathematical modeling, sometimes people quote this to me from this gentleman named Professor George Box, who was one of the greatest statistical minds of the 20th century. He says that all models are wrong, but some are useful. All models are wrong, but some are useful. Now, yes, to a certain extent, he's correct. However, I would have to say this, in the real world, if mathematical models are absolutely wrong, this could have serious consequences on the economy, time, and most importantly, a cost to human life. So doing nothing is not an option. There's no real alternative to do, let's say, mathematical modeling. So give you, let's say, one example. There's this gentleman here. His name is Professor Keith Still. Now, what he does, let's say, mathematical modeling of crowd dynamics and crowd safety. See, what he did, let's say, a mathematical model of the Hajj pilgrim in Saudi Arabia. And what he was trying to do, he's trying to avoid crowd stampede by looking at the movement of 1 million people going around the pillar. And he's done other mathematical models as well. So this is a useful model and shown the usefulness of modeling. But also, Keith Still came up with some principles about mathematical modeling. He talked about mathematical modeling outcomes. And he said a good mathematical modeling outcome is to understand, to predict, and to influence. A mathematical model should help you to understand, to predict, and to influence. But he also went on to saying there are bad mathematical modeling outcomes, because the one that says purely to predict and to control, where we lose to understand goes out the window. So I'm just going to give you one example to understand, to predict, and to influence. One day, there was a Royal Navy captain, and he approached me and he said, Naira, I said, hello. I said, we've heard that you are somebody that likes solving real world problems. And I said, yes, I do. And he said, well, we have a ship that is very expensive to build, but unaffordable to run. And is there a way, a mathematical way of actually solving the problem? And I thought, okay, let me try and understand this. So I said to him, have you ever heard the story Goldilocks and the Three Bears? And he says, you what? And I said, Goldilocks and the Three Bears. See, there's a part of the story like this, where Goldilocks goes into the house, she sees his porridge, she eats his porridge, she says, this is too hot, this is too cold, well, that's just right. That's how you solve your problem. And he just looked at me and he went away, and I didn't see him again for about 2 weeks. Then I went into a room and it looked like this. And I said, hello, and what's this all about? And they said, well, this meeting is all about cancelling this future ship project. And we've heard that you come up with a solution. And I said, oh, yes, I have. And they said, can you tell us about it? And I said, have you heard the story Goldilocks and the Three Bears? And it says, we beg your pardon. I said, Goldilocks and the Three Bears. You see, Goldilocks, she goes into the house, she sees a porridge, and she says, that porridge is too hot, this porridge is too cold, well, this porridge is just right. That is how you solve the problem. And they were not too impressed with my explanation. But what I did was I actually showed them a mathematical model, showed them an analogy, and related it to the ship. Where what I said to them is, what you need to do is relate the cost to the capability to the design, and that what you'll get is that you will have a future ship that is affordable. And they said, oh, actually, that could actually work. So henceforth, I handed over the solution to them for them to test and try out, but that was over 10 years ago. The question is, would you like to see what that ship looks like today? See, now that is the HMS Queen Elizabeth, which is the largest aircraft carrier that the Royal Navy ever had. Now, my name, as well as other contributors to this aircraft carrier, will be on that ship for the next 50 years. So that's with me using the principle of understand, to predict, and to influence. And by actually showing them and actually exploring actually the solutions, we could actually see what type of solutions that could actually existed out there to make this aircraft carrier possible. So moving on, talking about the Kursk disaster. Again, a torpedo exploded inside the submarine and it sank. Half the sailors died straight away. The other sailors survived for about a week, and the world heard them banging on the side of the submarine, saying that that's out. And unfortunately, despite the numerous rescue attempts, there was no survivors. And despite what the public's saying, worldwide, saying this is, what can be done about this, a solution, the expert says that a solution is near impossible. However, in 2005, a certain mathematician named Nora Chamberlain did a presentation at a conference, and he says this: guess what? Have you ever heard the story Goldilocks and the Three Bears? The reason why that a solution has never been possible before, because either we've gone in too big or too small. But actually, when I do a simulation and do a physical demonstration, I show that there is actually a way of maximizing the probability of actually saving people who are down in a downed submarine. And I showed them, and I did the simulation and did the demonstration, and people looked at that and actually changed the narrative. See, that was April 2005. And in August 2005, with this change in narrative, a British team actually went out and saved another submarine that actually was a Russian submarine that had seen, because what mathematical modeling had done, through understanding, through prediction, through influence, we had actually changed the narrative. So what is the point of modeling? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to quote the Nobel Prize winner physicist Richard Feynman, and he said this: in order to understand the world around us, it is necessary to have a deeper understanding of mathematical relationships. This is what's the point of mathematical modeling. Thank you very much indeed.
Naira, that was enthralling, I think. Fantastic. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm particularly intrigued by how the HMS Queen Elizabeth sits right in the middle of the Goldilocks zone. Fascinating stuff. I'm sure there are many questions that will come for that, but the one I have at the moment is it important that the public understands? You talked about good and bad mathematical models. Is it important that the public, i.e. my constituents and others' constituents, understand what a good and a bad model look like? And how do we assess who is in the right position to judge what is good and bad?
I mean, what I was been talking about there is, let's say, principles. I mean, one of the, somebody said is that, let's say, with mathematics is like the poetry of logical ideas. And somebody once said, quoted a French mathematician one time to me, said that if you can't explain your mathematics to the first person you meet on the street, then your mathematics is incomplete. And so, when I was actually saying to, let's say, to the military stakeholders, Goldilocks, there was actually understanding and getting it. And so henceforth, when I actually saw the model, they can actually add more understanding of it. So the way we actually communicate what our model is all about, but also show the assumptions and the limitations about the model and say, this is where it's worked, this is where it won't work, when that would actually help. And I actually do believe that it's important that us as a mathematical community and a scientific community, we be able to communicate about mathematical models in a much more better way.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. And I look forward to, as I said, seeing some questions come through in due course. We've already got a couple coming through. So, okay, thank you again. We will move on to our next speaker, which is Kit Yates.
Hi.
Hi.
See that?
Yes, I can. So sort of over to you for 10 minutes, please.
Great, perfect. So, hi, my name is Kit Yates. I am a senior lecturer in mathematical biology at the University of Bath. I'm also a math popularizer and an author, and my latest book, The Maths of Life and Death, tries to explain some of the situations and subtleties associated with the mathematical modelling of epidemics. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today, mathematical modelling in the context of COVID and trying to communicate those models. So we have all sorts of data streams coming at us on COVID all the time. Things like cases, the number of cases that come back positive every day, the positivity rate. So that's the number of cases divided by the total number of tests so that we can account for the fact that testing might be changing. We have hospitalizations, hospital admissions, we have hospital occupancy, so we can understand how full or empty our hospitals are. We have deaths coming back. These are lagged from case data by quite a long time, but they're an important metric to understand how well or badly a country's been doing overall during the pandemic. We have things like vaccination coverage, because we know how important the vaccination program's been in the UK, broken down by first and second doses, because that makes a difference to the protection you get. We have data on new variants that might be emerging and potentially scupper our vaccination program. So it's important to understand all of these different data streams if you're going to be making evidence-based policy. So each one of these comprises a piece of the jigsaw puzzle, which we need to try to assemble to put them together in order to just try to get a glimpse of the bigger picture that we are hoping to see, and then in order to make policy based on that. And to do that, we need mathematical modeling, and specifically, we need to understand and build and draw all these different data sets together. So I've heard people throughout this pandemic say to me on Twitter or even in person, say, I don't believe in mathematical modeling. And for me, it strikes me as a really odd thing to say, because actually, whenever you're interpreting data, you're using a mathematical model, whether you know it or not. And the difference between mathematicians and non-mathematicians typically is that mathematicians will be clear about the assumptions and the model that they're using to interpret that data. So I'll give you an example. At the start of the pandemic, it was really important to understand what proportion of people who were catching COVID ended up dying from COVID. Because if it was a really small proportion, then maybe this wasn't a serious disease. But if it was actually a large proportion, then we really needed to do something about this to stop this disease spreading. So this was an incredibly important battleground at the start of the pandemic. And so there's a professor of evidence-based medicine at the University of Oxford, who I won't name, but he wrote in a very influential blog that he has, he tried to calculate this number, number of people who would die. So he calculated something called the case fatality ratio. So he looked at the number of cases in Germany, a country in Europe who was doing the most testing, so the biggest number of cases, therefore the biggest denominator here on the bottom of the fraction here. And he looked on one day on the 22nd of March, and he found that there were 23,000 cases and 93 deaths. And so divided 93 by 23,000 and came up with a figure of 0.5% for this case fatality rate, the number of cases that turn into eventually people dying. But actually, the case fatality rate isn't really that helpful. What's more useful to know is what's called the infection fatality rate, which is the number of people who get infected. Because remember, not everyone that gets infected actually gets tested and gets a positive test. Certainly at the start of the pandemic, when we didn't have huge testing capacity. So if we test fewer people, we find fewer cases. So actually, this professor of evidence-based medicine did was to assume that half of all the infections were missed. You just plucked this figure out of the air, and so divided the case fatality rate by 2 to get this infection fatality rate of 0.25, which was lower than many of the estimates that were out there at the time. And it sort of diminished the importance of COVID to some degree. But there were some huge problems with this calculation. So this model or this calculation is implicitly using a mathematical model, but not being upfront about the assumptions. So we know, for example, that on average, it takes about 3 weeks for people who catch COVID and go on to die for them to actually die. It doesn't just happen instantaneously. So this professor was essentially assuming that deaths occurred instantaneously. And actually, if you look on the 12th of April, 3 weeks after the date that was chosen, there are actually 3,000 deaths in Germany, because when cases are growing exponentially at the start of an epidemic, the number of cases will grow exponentially, as will the number of deaths eventually. So really what you need to do is, to get a better approximation, is to calculate the number of cases on a particular day and then look at the number of deaths they turn into 3 weeks later. And so you could get a better estimate of the case fatality rate by dividing this number of deaths on the 12th of April 2022 by the number of cases back on the 22nd of March to get a case fatality rate of 13%. That seems really high. That seems really serious. And actually, the other thing that was wrong about the original calculation was that we weren't missing half of all the cases that were out there, all the infections that were out there. We were probably missing far more than that. We were probably missing maybe 1 in 20 infections. Sorry, we're missing maybe 19 in 20 infections, only seeing 1 in 20. So to get a real infection fatality rate, you might think about dividing this number by 20 to get a more accurate representation. of about 0.65%, which is more than double the previous estimate, and it paints a different picture of how serious COVID is. The point of these are all rough calculations, and actually if you want to get a better approximation, you need to do some more complicated maths and have a more complicated model. The point of these calculations is that none of these estimates are in any sense absolutely correct. They are perhaps increasingly accurate representations of reality. But the point is that by not being upfront that you are using a mathematical model or modeling a complicated process, you can make incorrect assumptions. And if you aren't upfront about what those assumptions are, then they're not open to scrutiny and people can't question what you've done. So in fact, the picture in reality is even more complicated than the picture I've painted, because there isn't a single period from infection to death of 3 weeks. There's actually a distribution. So this is the distribution of time on the horizontal axis here, and the probability of dying on that day after being infected here. And actually the peak is around 2.5 weeks, but actually you can live for up to 50, 60 days after being infected from COVID. So really, to figure out the number of deaths you'd expect on a particular day, you need to think about who got infected yesterday, who got infected the day before, who got infected the day before that, and all the days preceding that one. So it's a bit more complicated. Similarly, there are huge variations in the risk of dying from COVID based on age. We think that every 7 years older you are, potentially your risk of dying from COVID is double to the people who are 7 years younger than you. And so this is a chart which shows age varying on the horizontal axis and the infection fatality rates, that calculation we were trying to do, varying on the vertical axis. And red is values for COVID and blue is values for flu. And you can see that there's a distinct difference. These are a lot of different values from different countries. You can see there's a massive difference between the infection fatality rate for COVID and the infection fatality rate for flu, but also that it varies with age. So talking about one single infection fatality rate for a whole population doesn't really make sense. So this nuance gets lost when you're not upfront about the facts, about the assumptions that you are using. So I think the other issue that we have in mathematical modeling is that some of the ideas and the subtleties get lost in the communication of the model. So we have seen some commentators and presenters and even scientists deriding modeling projections as being poor because the results that they predicted never came to pass, despite the fact that it might have been that those very projections altered people's behavior or altered policy, and effectively made themselves self-defeating prophecies. Now, probably the most well-known example of this is the model from Imperial College, which came out on the 16th of March in report 9, which predicted that if things stayed as they were, we would see 250,000 deaths in the UK as a result of the current policies. And eventually, a week after that report came out, that led to the government implementing a lockdown, which obviously changed things. But people said, well, those predictions were way out of line. We've not seen anywhere near those number of deaths. But of course, it was a self-defeating prophecy. And so this, when the model gets turned into a media story, it's easy to lose that subtlety, that the fact that it might have actually influenced policy. So actually, that same professor of evidence-based medicine that I mentioned before wrote an article in The Spectator where he wrote a list of failures in data, COVID data failures in the pandemic. And number one on the list was overestimating the number of people who were going to die. So this message has made its way into the popular arena that actually those models were no good, unfortunately. But if you look at the reality, despite all of the restrictions that we've been under, despite the excellent vaccines that we've developed, which have massively changed the game and meant that cases don't turn into deaths with such a high rate, we've still seen 150,000 deaths throughout this pandemic in the UK. So it's not beyond the realms of possibility or likelihood that we might have experienced up to 500,000 deaths had we done nothing. But this model became a self-defeating prophecy. But as a result of this miscommunication in the media, I've had radio presenters, when I've been on interviewing about COVID, people questioning me saying, well, no one believes Professor Ferguson's discredited predictions anymore, do they? As a result of this narrative that's come out. The assumptions need to be scrutinized. And if you don't agree with the assumptions of a model, then that's fine. You should feel free to disagree with the results of the model. But just because the model's prediction didn't come to pass, that isn't enough to tell you that model itself is wrong. So I think what we need to do as a community of mathematical modelers is to get better at communicating the assumptions and the uncertainty surrounding our models. And this is to some extent what I've been trying to do throughout the pandemic. And also to make sure that modelling available to the government should be made available to scrutiny to everyone, to the public, as soon as that's possible. And we should be making clear the assumptions underlying those models as well. I think just in terms of take-home messages, better numeracy in all walks of life, from politicians to journalists to the general public, is going to benefit us all as a nation, not just in the context of COVID, but in a wider context. I think it's really important to be clear that whenever you're analysing data, you are using mathematical models, whether you acknowledge that or not, and it's better to be upfront about those assumptions so they can be scrutinised in the long run. I think something that we've been learning the hard way as mathematicians is that nuance often gets lost in the translation in the media, and we need to try and take control of some of those narratives by communicating our mathematical models better. And I think that really mathematical modelling, at the end of the day, is the best way we have of quantifying the current situation and making predictions about the future. It's better than gut feelings. It's better than Harris-Bexey. It's better than consulting the Oracle. It's a hell of a lot better than the wishful thinking, which has guided some of the policy making during the pandemic. It's the scientific method in action. It isn't perfect, but it's honest. It's upfront about the assumptions it's making, the limitations that are associated with it. So I think mathematical model is the best way we have of understanding the world around us, and it should be at the heart of all evidence-based policymaking. Thanks.
Kit, thank you very much indeed. I have to say I've spent quite a lot of the last 18 months trying to communicate some of those quite complex principles to skeptical constituents who, not everyone is in favour of lockdowns and vaccines, and trying to communicate the differences between a certain course of action and why those models that were used at the beginning didn't come to turn into reality. Just as a quick aside on that is, as we move forward, and you talked about the death rate there of dying with COVID on the death certificate, or COVID 28 days within a COVID test. Do we need, if we are going to live alongside this virus, a more nuanced way of appraising those deaths? Because not all of them will have been from COVID, even though they died with COVID. And how difficult would that be to separate out, in your view?
Yeah, so the death certificate data is the best way of actually accessing that, because you can understand what the actual cause of death is. That figure is about 150,000. It's slightly higher than the deaths within 28 days. Deaths within 28 days is probably a really good proxy for the actual number of deaths of COVID, not with COVID. Probably about 90% of deaths which have COVID on the death certificate are actually from COVID, not with COVID. So the vast majority of those deaths are COVID deaths and should be attributed as such. But yeah, again, it's important to communicate those subtleties in the data so that people don't come back and say, well, these are deaths just with COVID, people testing positive after they've gone into hospital and died of something else. That actually we do understand the full impact of COVID and how potentially dangerous it is.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. Much appreciated. And again, I can see some questions dropping in, so we'll get to those in due course. Right, we move on to our third speaker. Let me just get my stopwatch up, which is going to be Ellen. Ellen, welcome again. Thank you for joining us. And again, congratulations on your recent OBE. Please, could we have sort of 10 minutes from you?
Yeah, well, thanks for inviting me to speak today. My name's Ellen Brooks-Pollock, and I'm one of the mathematical modelers that has contributed to COVID modelling over the past 18 months or so. So I've been interested in infectious diseases and how they spread for a long time. And just before the pandemic, as an example, I was working on the spread of TB in the UK, and also on the spread of hepatitis A in schools in England. So once it became clear in early 2020 that this novel coronavirus was likely to come to the UK and start spreading and causing an epidemic, together with colleagues, I repurposed an existing model that we'd already done for pandemic influenza for coronavirus. And this graph is one of the very first graphs that we ever produced back in February 2020. The different coloured lines show the possible epidemic trajectories based on different factors, and actually some of the green lines don't look that dissimilar to what actually happened. But of course, back in February 2020, we weren't able to choose between these different lines of what may or may not happen. However, because of this model and because of the other work on infectious diseases that I'd done, I was invited then to attend and start contributing to SPI-M, which, as you know, is the Scientific Pandemic Influenza Group on modelling. And that's one of the subgroups that feeds into the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, SAGE, which is the mechanism by which scientific advice is incorporated into decision-making and policy-making in the UK. Now, SPI-M is the biggest subgroup, and on a regular basis, there are 50 or more modelers that are contributing to SPI-M. And in general, although it's not impossible to pick up infectious disease modelling at the beginning of a pandemic, the vast majority of modelers have been doing it for decades or more. And this picture here shows a graph, a network that I made I wrote an article about how SPI-M functioned and modelling during the COVID pandemic for a Royal Society article. This picture here shows the circles are individuals contributing to SPI-M, and the lines between them are where they'd co-authored a scientific publication before coronavirus. The colours show the different groups, so you can see the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine in yellow, Imperial in green, and then Warwick and everyone who did their PhD in Warwick, like me, in orange. And you can see that although there are maybe more connections between the different groups, there are also a lot of connections between the groups. So infectious disease modelling is a well-established field in the UK with lots of people working together over a prolonged period of time, and many people contributing to SPI-M have worked on previous pandemics and previous epidemics. So SPI-M does lots of things, and some of which everyone knows about. On a weekly basis, SPI-M up until very recently was producing the R and growth rate estimates. And these numbers come out of not just a single model, but multiple different models. And the different modelling groups are encouraged to develop their own models independently. One of the questions that was asked is, how do you know a model's good? And that is a good question. And one of the things that you can do is you can develop lots of different models completely independently and see how they compare. If there's one that's an enormous outlier, you might start questioning some of the assumptions behind those models. So these R estimates that are produced on a weekly basis are from many different models that all combine together to produce these values. The same goes for the short and medium term forecasts. Those are not results from a single model, they're many models, and it's kind of averaged over many models. Then, as Kit mentioned, there's the scenario modelling, which is the aspect of SPI-M's work that often grabs the headlines. So that's looking at future projections over 6 or 12 months. And then, as well as parameter estimation, as well as Kit mentioned, there's also researcher-led contributions. These are not commissions, these are papers that come to SPI-M that have been initiated by scientists and modelers themselves. So I'm going to talk about something that started as my contribution, but then ended up more generally in SPI-M's work. So we know that COVID is spread via close social contact, and these social contacts occur just normally throughout the day when you're at home, when you catch the bus to work, at work with your in the office, then maybe in a shop after work, and then anything that you might do in the evening. All of these things generate social contacts. And we know from asking people how many people they spoke to on a normal day, that on average, an average person made 11 social contacts in a day. So they spoke to 11 people on a normal day. Taking into account these normal social contacts, if that person was infected with coronavirus, we also know that they would infect around 3 people over the course of their infectious period. And this number 3, this is the all-important R number. And just to remind you that if R is bigger than 1, it means the epidemic's growing, and if R is smaller than 1, the epidemic's shrinking. So because of the link between social contacts and this R number, the number of COVID cases that's produced by a person, it's really critical to understand quite closely what social contacts look like in a population. So as I mentioned, I've been involved, and others, including Hannah Fry, who's up after me, in actually measuring people's social contact patterns. So here are some examples of people's contact patterns. So this is a pupil, someone who's going to school. The orange triangle in the middle is the person who's responding to the survey, and then all the circles around and squares around them are contacts that they've reported. The red circles are household contacts, the blue circles are work or school contacts, the green circles are leisure contacts, and then the squares are groups of similar contacts. So there's a huge amount of variety between, as you might expect, between different people. Here's a retired person who responded to this particular survey. So you can see they've got 1 household contact in red, and then no work or school contacts, but mainly leisure contacts. And then here is an example of someone with a huge number of work contacts, a flight attendant. So they've got 3 contacts at home, but then they've got over 600 work contacts. And during March 2020, it was all of these contacts that were not household contacts that became prohibited with the stay-at-home order. And so we went from social networks on the previous slide to social networks that looked much more like this, just people's home contacts. Now, we don't just have the contact patterns of 3 people, we know the contact patterns of thousands and thousands of people. And using these data from thousands of people, we can create a map from the social contacts to the R value for COVID. And this is what that map looks like. So let me just talk you through this figure. So on the horizontal axis, this is the percentage of normal work and leisure contacts, so contacts outside the home, that occur. When we're at the left-hand side, that's at 0%. That's kind of a full-on lockdown where the only contacts you have are at home. On the right-hand side, this is where completely normal behaviour, 100% of normal contacts are active. Then the vertical axis is the reproduction number, or the R value, and that goes from 0, where you don't make any secondary COVID cases and you don't transmit to anyone, up to 3, and that was the value at the start of the pandemic in the UK. These different coloured ribbons represent schools being either open or shut. So the grey ribbon is schools being closed, the yellow ribbon is primary schools open, and the red ribbon is primary and secondary open. And then we've got one in between, which is a turquoise one, which is where just selected year groups within a primary school go to school. And we know that through surveys that at the height of lockdown in April 2020, people made on average 20% of their normal social contacts. And that puts us where this red dot is, that puts us around here. So we've got a reproduction number and R value of about 0.7, and with 20% of active work and leisure contacts taking place. So the question that came to SPI-M was, what would happen if schools reopened? And you can see by moving around this chart that you can work out what would happen if schools opened. So by moving the red dot, we're going the wrong way, moving the red dot to the yellow ribbon, our estimate back in April was that opening primary schools would increase the R value by a little bit to around 0.9, but not by enough to tip the R value over this important R equals 1 threshold. You can also see, I keep going the wrong way, that if we did open secondary schools, our estimate and the estimate of other groups was that this would increase the reproduction number to something that would cause the epidemic to carry on growing. However, we obviously didn't just have schools opening and closing at our disposal. There were other things that were being introduced, like COVID security, by which I mean mask wearing and keeping 2 meters away from other people, and contact tracing via the test, trace and isolate program. And so we can incorporate all of those things into this relationship between social contacts and the R value. And you get a picture that's more like this. So it's much flatter because each social contact isn't as risky in terms of COVID transmission. So instead of going up to the red bar up here of a reproduction number greater than 1, now opening secondary schools actually keeps us in this safe area where we've got a reproduction number and R value of less than 1. And I spent much of 2020 making these type of figures for a variety of different scenarios. So changing the amount of contacts that are traced, changing the level of COVID security. I've got ones for different levels of variants, for vaccination most recently. And what this allows you to do is, it's a mathematical model, but the power is really in the person making the decision, because you can chart your way through lifting lockdown measures, by balancing different levels of contact tracing and different levels of COVID security, or for example, we've got other ones with preventing large gatherings or keeping people working from home, all the different strategies. So that was really where I was going to wrap up. So I wanted to, so my main message really, I wanted to give an example of a modelling approach that has supported the relaxing of measures, because as is often picked up in the headlines, modelling is often seen as a force for bad, that we're predicting huge numbers of cases. Actually, quite a lot of the work supported schools reopening, which didn't happen in other countries. There's also other modelling that I was involved in that supported the creation of support bubbles, and by demonstrating that actually single person households could safely join with larger households without increasing transmission potential in a population. The work of SPI-M is very much encouraged to be researcher led, so many independent teams are really required to get robust answers. It's never a good idea if you're just relying on the output of a single model, but it's really important to have multiple independent approaches which allow you to really assess how reliable evidence is. And throughout this process, we've been encouraged to develop our own independent methods that are different from other groups. So just to, as a final slide, these ready reckoners, as they were nicknamed, can be used by anyone. They're completely open access online. You can explore the behaviour and the relationship between social contacts and this R value. I guest edited a Royal Society special issue containing 20 articles from modellers that contributed to SPI-M. There are over 100 people who are authors in that special issue, and it's all open access. I would encourage you to have a look at it. It includes modelling, well, on these ready reckoners, on support bubbles, on hospital transmission.
Ellen, I'm going to have to interrupt you, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
I've got to go and vote, but okay. That was absolutely fascinating. The question that I'm not going to hear the answer to really was, obviously that was the modelling back at the beginning of the pandemic.
Yeah.
How, presumably the contact pattern, you've got to keep surveying that as the pandemic progressed, and then factor in the effect of the vaccine, presumably. Is that correct?
Yeah, so this contact patterns approach is really one approach, but yes, we have to incorporate the vaccine, which obviously has different age-specific effects. And this particular method doesn't rely, because we're essentially switching on and off social contacts So it relies on knowing about social contact patterns at the beginning, and then you can turn them on and off. But there are others, groups, for instance, the London School, John Edmonds, who are surveying contact patterns on a weekly basis to find out how things are changing.
Excellent, thank you very much. Steve and Ben, sorry, Ellen, thank you very much for that. Absolutely brilliant. Stephen, I'm going to pass over to you, if I may, to welcome Hannah and marshal it through, and I'll be back as soon as I can once I've voted.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Well, welcome to everybody, and it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Hannah Fry, Centre for Advanced Spatial Analysis, Faculty of the Built Environment at UCL. And without any more ado, Hannah, please do address us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Yes, I think we've had some really impressive examples there of what mathematical models can do, in terms of preventing crowd crashes, in terms of understanding a disease like COVID. And there are many, many more examples of the impressive nature of mathematical models besides. But I actually wanted to talk to you about a slightly different issue, because I think that when it comes to applying these very heavily data-driven approaches to real-world problems, I think it's very important to consider the questions that you're asking in a wider context. So to explain what I'm talking about here, I wanted to start off with an example of actually, I think one of the most impressive advances of recent years, which is medical screening. And we are now in a situation where, as I'm sure you're all aware, but that just by a chain of logic, by a manipulation of numbers, we now have algorithms that are capable of recognizing abnormalities in tissue better than doctors can. I think this is really going to transform diagnosis as time goes on. The thing is, with this example, the mathematical manipulation of these images is one thing, but I think that you have to think of this in the wider context. So first off, there are issues around bias, which I think have now permeated through to public consciousness. And that appears even in a situation like this. For instance, tissue is not uniform across all female bodies. There is an overrepresentation in the data of women from recent European descent, which can have an issue in skewing how effective this diagnosis is in some groups over others. But I think that there's actually another problem here, a problem that goes beyond just a sort of technical problem of how good your data is, and really speaks to how you think about the questions that you apply mathematical modeling to. So this really, it comes down to, in this case anyway, it comes down to the fact that actually cancer is not binary, right? It's not a situation where you either have cancer or you don't. Actually, cancer, and particularly breast cancer here, exists along a spectrum where you can have anything from very normal tissue at one end to very nasty metastatic invasive cancer at the other end. And really, tissue abnormalities can appear at any step along this spectrum. Now, you can train mathematical models and mathematical algorithms to hone in on each of these different abnormalities, but that really isn't the end of the story. And I think that's something that's best demonstrated by a study that was actually done in the 1970s in Denmark. So what happened in Denmark? A group of pathologists, they took a group of 77 recently deceased women and got the family's permission to perform double mastectomies on each one of these women. Now, these women, they had died from all kinds of other causes. So things like a car crash or a heart attack, a whole range of different causes. None of these women had a diagnosis of breast cancer, right? So they were kind of walking around not having the label of breast cancer over them. And the question from these pathologists was, okay, how many of these women actually have abnormalities in their cells? How many people are wandering around, in daily life, not knowing that they have cancerous tissue within their bodies? Now, in 77 women, you might expect, okay, maybe there's going to be a couple here, maybe one or two. Actually, what these pathologists found is that almost a quarter of these women had some abnormality that existed along this spectrum. Now, this is a study that has been repeated several times for different types of cancer, prostate cancer, thyroid cancer, and every time the result is the same. The estimates are that around 9% of us at any one time are walking around with cancerous tissue in our bodies that we are totally unaware of. Now, okay, this doesn't mean that there's a silent epidemic that is about to hit, right? It's about 10 times the number of people who are diagnosed, that 9% at any one time. It doesn't mean that suddenly there's going to be a huge issue with cancer. What it actually means is that most cancerous cells are handled by your body. Most of the time, cancerous cells never grow into something that will kill you. They're just dealt with by your body, and they never go on to be something that could really harm you. Now, here is the thing. The better that mathematical algorithms get at detecting these abnormalities, the higher the risk, the better that we become at detecting cancer, the higher the risk that we are going to tell people that they have cancer when it is a cancer that actually would not go on to harm them at all. We are going to be affecting people potentially with very life-changing surgeries and treatments who actually never needed to know about the harmless cancer that is living within their tissue. Now, I like to think of this, I think that the issue really here is something that I like to call the Kahnemanian swap. Danny Kahneman, Nobel Prize winning economist, he said that people have a habit of taking a very difficult question and swapping it for an easy one without necessarily noticing that they've made the substitution. And I think that this issue around cancer is a really great example of that, because the very difficult question that we actually want to answer is whose lives could be saved by these kind of algorithms, whose dangerous cancer could be stopped by using this kind of algorithm, by noticing those abnormal cells. And that is swapped for a much easier question that is subtly different, which is who has abnormal cells within their body. And when you don't notice that swap, I think that's where some of these issues can arise. I think we saw this too, the same swap with the sort of disastrous A-level results issue of 2020, because the very difficult question in that scenario was, in a year like 2020, how do we fairly award grades to students? And that was swapped for the easier question of how do we make this year's grades look like last year's grades? And in that swap, that's kind of where things really went wrong. You may have also read about the use of algorithms within the judicial system, trying to assess the risk of an individual going on to commit another crime in future. And that decision, that algorithm being used by judges to decide whether or not somebody should be awarded bail, or in some cases, how long someone's sentence should be. And there too, you have another one of these swaps, because the question people think they're answering is who will go on to commit another crime. But of course, you don't have data on all the crimes that are committed. You only have data on who goes on to be rearrested for another crime. And in that swap, I think that is really where these problems of mathematical models being used apply. This also, by the way, is actually a real problem at the very cutting edge of theoretical research on artificial intelligence, about that gap that appears between what you really care about and what you can possibly transcribe into numbers. A very brilliant paper that was published about 2 years ago now, really summarized a series of examples of quite funny situations where this gap appeared. Just a couple of my favorites very, very quickly. There was one algorithm that was tasked with completing a sort of race course. It was allowed to build itself whatever body it wanted. This is an agent in artificial intelligence, to get itself from the start line to the finish line. And the researchers were like, oh, we're going to see, the emergence of limbs, we're going to see the emergence of wheels, all of that kind of thing. But in the process of training, the algorithm did the swap itself. And instead of building any of those things, the algorithm worked out that it could complete the task just by building a body that was really, 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 really tall, and then just flopping itself over so that it crossed the finish line, which is technically achieving what it was asked to do, just not quite in the spirit of what was meant. Another one, which I think is slightly more ominous, there was an algorithm that was tasked with landing a simulated aircraft. So kind of think about Microsoft's flight simulator, that kind of thing. And the task that was given to it was to land the plane with as little force on the simulated body of the aircraft as possible, which was seen as a proxy for landing the plane well. Now, the researchers went off, leaving this algorithm to train in doing this. And they expected the algorithm to bring the plane in nice and gently to land to get this very low force registered on the body. Instead, while they were away, the algorithm realized that if instead of bringing this plane in nice and gently to land, if instead it just deliberately slammed the plane into the ground, the force that would be registered on the aircraft would be so great, it would overwhelm the memory of the system and instead register as a perfect 0. So the researchers came back just to see this algorithm repeatedly slamming the plane into the ground. I think that's a lesson there in just how important it is to get this stuff right. I think this is the point, really, that there is sometimes this gap that appears between what you can measure and what you can reasonably, what you really care about. And my concern is that as powerful as these tools can be, and believe me when I tell you I'm a gigantic advocate of them, I think that sometimes when algorithms are dressed up as some kind of artificial intelligence, they can take on an air of authority that actually makes them really difficult to argue with. There are studies that show this, a particularly interesting one by Ayana Howard. She shows that people will follow a robot that acted like it knew where it was going, even in dangerous settings. So she set up an experiment where a building started to fill with smoke, and a bad robot was leading a series of unwitting participants out of the building, supposedly. People would literally walk past emergency exit signs, climb over furniture into smoke-filled dark rooms just because a robot told them to do so. I think, the point I'm trying to make here really is that these things are, they're not a mirror to reality. There's a gap between what they can do and what we really want to do. And unless we're careful about that, we can get into a habit of over-trusting the credibility of these things. That's something I think that can have quite dangerous consequences. One story I wanted to leave you with that I think really highlights this is something that happened in Idaho. This is a few years ago, where the Department of Health and Welfare, they announced that they were introducing a new budget tool, a new algorithm that was going to calculate the amount of welfare that disabled residents of the state were entitled to. Now, there was a group of 16 disabled residents who relied very heavily on these benefits. Each one of them qualified for residential care, but had chosen instead to be cared for in the community. So this money was really important to each of them to ensure that they could keep their independence. And one by one, each of these individuals went into the State Department, where the budget tool, the swanky new budget tool that they'd announced, would calculate how much money each one of them was entitled to. And what was really strange was that some of them ended up getting way more money than they'd had in previous years, right? Which is kind of good, I guess. But others simultaneously ended up being, tens of thousands of dollars in deficit. So the group of them came together and tried to work out how this thing could possibly have been making its decisions. They asked for support from the department and were told that the algorithm had made the decision and that was final. In the end, actually, they had to file a class action lawsuit to have this algorithm turned over for scrutiny. And when the algorithm was turned over, they sort of expected, the way that they had spoken about it, they sort of expected it to be this really sophisticated mathematical model, this really sort of beautifully crafted artificial intelligence. In fact, actually, once it was turned over for scrutiny, it was actually just an Excel spreadsheet. And if you'll forgive me for being crude, quite a rubbish one at that. Had errors all over the place. In fact, the formulas were all wrong. In fact, this spreadsheet was, the maths in this spreadsheet was so bad that the judge would eventually rule it unconstitutional. Now, I love the idea of there being unconstitutional mathematics. That makes me extremely happy. But I think the point is this. I think that people have a bias towards simplifying questions. I think people have a bias in believing in the cleverness of automation, but we also have a bias of throwing things away as soon as they're shown to be even a tiny bit flawed. I think Kit was mentioning stuff about this earlier. But I think the most important point for me overall is that mathematical tools are by far one of the most mighty tools we have at peering into the future. And I think that the people who can best harness their potential are those who understand their power, but also their limitations. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Hannah. And some of those examples are just fascinating. Stephen has arrived back from voting, so I'll immediately hand back to him. But I must say, it's been really interesting to listen to everything you've had to say. So, Stephen, over to you.
Thank you, Stephen. Obviously, sadly, I didn't hear all of Hannah's presentation, which was a great shame. Was there any particular point that you wanted to expand on, Stephen, or?
Well, I mean, I do have a general question, which
Yeah,
I think
fire away.
does get reflected in what Hannah said. What I'd like to ask all our panelists, and they've been wonderful contributions, is what do you argue about between you? Where are the points of difference when you get together and discuss in general terms the fantastic work that you're doing? Where are the arguments at the moment in the world of mathematical modeling?
Who would like to take that one to start with? Yes, I think I saw Kit there.
I'll have a crack. I don't think this is necessarily an argument, but I think there is a big debate going on about ethics in mathematics at the moment and the implications of the work that we do as mathematical modelers. I think we like to think that that we are just sort of locked away somewhere and just doing some abstract maths, and that no one will ever be interested in it, and it doesn't have any implications. But actually, as applied mathematicians, and you know, as Ellen clearly has demonstrated, the work that Ellen's doing has huge ethical implications. And I think you know, we're getting better at being aware of that, and I think the question is how we manage our outputs and make sure that our mathematical tools are not used for evil but are used for good, and that they get the correct interpretation, and that we do something to control the narrative around the work that we're doing. So I think that's maybe not a bone of contention between us, but I think it's certainly something that we're having to become more aware of at the moment.
If I could just jump in, actually, I also think just picking up on what Kit was saying earlier in his talk about the narrative of things, I think that there's a bit of a debate among mathematicians about how much it is our duty to really communicate these ideas. I remember a professor who was at the university when I was an undergraduate, and he had a phrase which was, "The world fears mathematicians, we should keep it that way," which is something definitely represents the other side of the argument to me. I personally think that actually we have a responsibility, really, given that these things are embedded in virtually every level of decision making in the private sector, and increasingly in every decision in the public sector. I think that as people who understand this stuff, as people who are contributing to these models, I think that we have a deeply held responsibility to ensure that the public feel like mathematical modeling is something that is done with them and not to them.
The point well made. Anyone else want to have a view on Stephen's question about where are the disagreements? Yes, Ellen. Thank you.
I suppose one aspect is maybe not a disagreement, but is the kind of contrast between these very complex individual-based models, whether they're actually better for making predictions or simpler models. At one point in the olden days, we only had simpler models, but then with computing power, everything kind of veered towards simulating everybody going to the shops, coming home and doing everything. But now it's increasingly understood that actually those models have problems in themselves, that they're almost too complex, and people are going back to thinking about how simpler models can help. So it's this balance between complexity and not making things too simple, I think, is an ongoing discussion.
Thank you. Naira?
Well, I mean, if there's any disagreement, it tends to happen right at the beginning, where we're saying you take this approach and somebody, no, you go left, and we say go right, and then we all go in different directions, and sometimes we end up in different places, and then instead of arguing about the logic, we're arguing about the assumptions that we make. But it's all good fun. It's all good fun. We enjoy it.
Excellent, excellent. Well, thank you all very much, and thank you, Stephen, for sitting in for me for a little while. I'm going to now go to the questions, and the first one is, other than Stephen's, obviously, is from Doug Marriott. If we could unmute Doug, and then you'll be able to ask your question.
Oh, thank you very much.
Are you connected twice, Doug, on two different devices?
Oh, I wonder if that's...
If you could mute one of them.
So, Sorry about.
Okay, shall I ask your question as typed in the Q&A? Well, basically, what Doug put in the Q&A was what methodology shall be used to address especially female oppression in Afghanistan. I don't know if anyone has experience of that kind of modelling.
I can speak to this a little bit. So I
Thanks,
think
Hannah.
this is one of those examples where I think sometimes when all you've got is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And I think that this is one of those occasions where I think you have to be very careful about instantly jumping to a mathematical model as the solution. I think that there are definitely questions that you can use mathematical modeling to look at in that sphere. I think you can look at things like I don't know, on an international stage, you can look at different tactics to implement policies and persuade, the spread of of information. There are different questions that you can ask, but I think that ultimately is a very big question that is not one that you could directly tackle straight away with mathematical modeling.
No, and even if you were able to come up with a model and a methodology, how easy would it be able to get the data about what's happening on the ground in Afghanistan at the moment? Because presumably everything's based on data.
Well, not actually. I mean, you can do some, they call them toy models, where you can play around. I mean, the question would need to be narrowed down. I'm struggling. I don't know if any of the other speakers can think of like a question that you could reasonably ask. But you can do something with a toy model where you understand the mechanisms of things, and you don't necessarily have to have it completely based on data to make progress. One of the examples there is if you're looking at, say, the effect that initiatives will have on how people act when it comes to climate change. That's an example of a model that doesn't necessarily need to have concrete data. Nara, though, you said that you've got an idea.
Yeah, I mean, not that exact question, but I mean, certainly when Hannah was talking about a toy model, the only closest I can get to is Schelling did a model in I think the 1970s, where it was looking at segregation of United States cities between, let's say, African Americans and other communities, and it's saying that if you had, let's say, a completely mixed community, that's how it started up. How did it actually turn out to be segregated? And he actually built in it, let's say, this toy model and this rule, and you can actually see how the dynamics go to where you can actually see where cities are now in America, where you get segregated communities. So again, from those doing those toy models and looking at those rules, that's also to implement it. So you're very much moving towards, let's say, that economics types of mathematics. So is there a way? Let me think about it, but I'm not going to tell you right now.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. We'll go to our next question, which is Brian Hanley. Brian, are you with us?
Yeah. Hi, Stephen.
Hi, Brian. If you could just remind us where you're from.
I'm from Norwich, and I'm actually on the committee.
Excellent.
I have a couple of questions, but one of them I think is a simpler one. Do the panelists, individually or collectively, have any examples of models that are highly precise but totally wrong?
Highly precise but totally wrong.
I should say I'm a chemist, so I'm very aware of the difference between precision and accuracy.
Good point. Anyone?
It wouldn't be a very good model. I'd like to think that if it was highly precise but wrong, I think that you'd immediately want to try and question the axioms.
Kit, what would you add to that?
I guess I'd back up what Hannah's saying. Like, when we're doing applied mathematics, we typically go through this cycle, which is build a model, make a prediction from the model, test that prediction, a bit of what Nara was saying in his talk, really. And then you don't just stop there. When your model doesn't work, you go back to your model and change the assumptions that didn't make sense or that were a bit more shaky, and go back and you make a new prediction and do a new test against the data. So I'd hope that by the time we're able to publish or feel comfortable publishing our models or putting them out there for the world to see, that we've gone through this cycle enough times that eventually we've got, every time we go through the cycle, it improves, and then hopefully by the time we've finished, it actually matches all the data that we've got and doesn't disagree. So hopefully there aren't too many models that get put out there that are that are completely wrong at that stage.
Brilliant, thank you. Ellen, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I was just going to add that sometimes it might be difficult to know how right or wrong a model is. I mean, models often with single sets of parameters give you a very precise number, like 13.5 people are going to catch COVID, and it's always wrong. But you want that. How do you know how wrong is acceptable? And so actually, that is a good question, and not an easy question, because if the actual number was 14, you might think it was wrong, but it's still almost right. But if it's 200, you might say that, oh, it's actually too wrong to be useful. And actually quantifying that uncertainty associated with models is quite difficult. So it's a good question, and I don't have an answer, but I think it's a difficult question.
Okay, thank you. Should we go to our next question, which is from Kurt Langfeld? Kurt Langfeld. Kurt, are you with us? Yes.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm Kurt Langfeld from the University of Leeds. I've attended a couple of these meetings, and we always hear about the successes in mathematics or another area of science. But I would have hoped that we get more out of this in this get together here at this stage. And so my question is around, can politics help to increase the appreciation of mathematical modeling in the broader population? And I think Kit's talk just alluded to the problem. Clearly, mathematics has saved lives during the pandemic, but public does not have the baseline. And there's never ever enough lives saved. So what would have happened without modeling? And only modelers can answer this question retrospectively, which doesn't help. So I wonder whether we can have a discussion around how can we actually work closer together with mathematical modeling, politics, and communication to the wider public in order to make this more effective.
Brilliant, thanks, Kurt, for that. Shall I go to Naira first, and then to you, Hannah?
Okay, I mean, in terms of politics, I mean, I can say like a general, it's a general statement. It's like, recently this evening, we've illustrated the breadth of applications of mathematics and shown the importance of mathematics in public policy. We encourage to see that mathematics sciences is included into the, let's say, the chief scientist strategy for government science and engineering professions, and hope that the way mathematics underpins so many different disciplines will be reflected in appropriate structures with a head of professions for mathematics as professionals and learners society for mathematics in the UK. Now, the IMA, I know we are ready to support a development of a professional structure, but as well as traditional applications to public policies in statistics and operational research, the mathematics societies are involved in emerging areas of public importance, such as cybersecurity and artificial intelligence, as well as modelling and algorithms. Government increasingly needs a well-equipped mathematical profession to advise us on and respond to new and emerging opportunities and issues.
Excellent. Thank you. Hannah?
That was the official answer.
Yeah, right.
I think that actually it sort of links in with what Naira was just saying. I think the part of the issue about appreciation of mathematics at the moment, or mathematical models, despite how they are increasingly important, is that at the moment they feel like they're this very niche thing. Like when you're in school, it's like there's the maths over in the corner with like the dusty textbooks, right? And then you kind of got all of the other subjects over here. And I think what I would personally like to see is the education system reflecting what's happened in reality, which is that these kind of systems are infiltrating absolutely everything. I'd quite like to see it where in history class, you go through, I don't know, documents from the Old Bailey and like categorize the data and see how crimes have changed over time. Or, in geography, where you're like actually getting your hands dirty with the data of how one country compares to another. And just recognizing that actually, I think there's been this shift, really a paradigm shift in the way that we understand our world, and taking mathematics out of that corner and recognizing its role in everything.
Thank you. Kit?
Yeah, just briefly, I think politicians do have a really important role to play in encouraging people to understand the seriousness and the importance and the role that mathematics can play. I think to some degree, politicians need to do this by example. I think the more high profile the politician, the more important it is that they do this by example, by demonstrating that they are au fait or they understand the numbers. Like if you look to Germany, for example, Chancellor Merkel, she goes on news conferences and she talks about the reproduction number, and she says, I know what this means. It means that each person will pass this number on to this disease onto this number of people. And if we can bring this below 1, then that means that we can start to bring the disease under control and to get it dying out. And even those relatively straightforward mathematical epidemiological ideas, but just demonstrating that you know that they're important and that you can explain them in a simple way makes a huge difference to bring the public on board and thinking, yeah, actually, this is a really simple idea that's mathematical, but it's going to make a big difference to people's lives. So I think, yeah, setting an example is really important for a politician.
Thank you for that, Ellen.
Yeah, I'd just add to Kit's point that politicians can help by engaging in mathematical models and asking questions about them, because not all models that we produce are useful. Some are completely incomprehensible, and by saying, oh well, asking questions about it and saying it would be more useful if it was presented like this, or if it answered this question, is really helpful from a modeler's point of view, because sometimes it's not always clear from a modeler's point of view what people actually need to know.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I mean, my view, I think the points that have been made are very valid. One of my concerns has been, not just over this period, but over an extended period, is that there doesn't seem to be a connection between the mathematics that one might do in school on a rainy Wednesday afternoon and the potential game-changing effect that could have at some later point. And trying to get people to understand that big data or data science has the potential to solve many of the global challenges that we face, I don't think that connection exists within schools. And therefore, I think there is a missing piece of this puzzle, which is potentially to have outside involvement inside schools to help the teachers to inspire their pupils that what they're doing actually is really valuable. But I take on board the points about, we need to be more mathematically aware and speak about maths in more confident terms. And I suspect it's an area where people don't necessarily feel overly confident to talk about it, because it is so, there is a right answer and a wrong answer often when talking about these things, and if you get it wrong, you get absolutely slated. I once quoted that 1 in 10 of the world's tractors was built in my constituency. I missed out 1 in 10 of the world's biggest tractors, which is still factually true, £7.5 billion worth of export. But I got absolutely castigated, as you can imagine. Anyway, enough of me, but I think the point is well made about improving maths capital, if you like. Our next questioner is Lillian Nandy. Lillian.
Hi, I'm Lillian, and I'm just an interested member of the public in all this. And with regards to mathematical modelling, there's currently a lot of interest around the world in local communities in how we can make our environment better in different localities. For example, they're increasing the number of green spaces so that there's more bees and wildlife, and this is supposed to make the environment a lot better. But have there actually been any mathematical or scientific modeling going on in this area? I mean, I assume we're doing the right thing, but I guess you don't really know unless you've actually measured these things and done some modeling and collected some data. So is there any sort of science going on in this?
Okay, thank you for that, Lillian. Who would like to pick up on that first? Oh, Hannah.
Yes, there's tons, Lillian. There's tons of stuff going on. There's some really interesting work using satellite data to monitor green spaces and how they change over time, which in the UK, we have a really good understanding of it, but worldwide, actually, that really makes a massive difference. There's some really old, sort of well-established area called game theory, which has been deployed much more recently to things like looking at people's attitude towards climate change, looking at how things like extra taxes and levies and incentives will alter people's behavior. There's also lots of work looking at systems dynamics, where when you have an ecological system and you make one change, you boost one area of it, what the impact of it is elsewhere, and lots of really like just brilliant studies where they're doing things like categorizing photographs in the Serengeti, automatic cameras that turn on as they detect movement, and using algorithms to automatically categorize what creature is photographed, even if it's like sort of the tuft of an ear as it flies past. So there's lots and lots and lots and lots of ways. Plus there's also, as I'm sure Naira knows more about than I do, but an awful lot of modeling the Earth as a whole, and climate science and environmental science, which is just, it's mathematical models all the way down.
Brilliant, thank you. Anyone else want to comment, or shall I go on to another question? Kit? And then I'm going to go on to Lance Carr will be after this.
I was just going to briefly, it was an excellent answer from Hannah, not much to add, but there are models of things like desertification, of the impacts of climate change, all of these sorts of things. And basically, more broadly, any quantitative question you want to ask, whether it's about, are there more bees out there than there used to be, or are there fewer? Are we seeing a real decline? What will be the impact if we keep on going with particular pesticides, etc., etc.? Any quantitative question you want to ask, we can build a mathematical model to represent that situation. We just need the data to parameterize it. So yeah, it's a case of going out there into the field, collecting that data, coming back and building that model, and deciding the question you want to ask, and building the model to try and find the answer to that. So yeah, really anything quantitative, we can have a crack at answering it.
Brilliant. Thank you. Right, let's go to try and get a few more in. Lance Carr. Lance, hi.
Hi, I am a mathematician and I work at Nottingham Trent University in their technology department, so in IT services and such. And one of the challenges that I'm running into a lot is, whilst there's a lot of talk from sort of higher ups about engaging with modeling or engaging with concepts such as AI, there isn't really an engagement with the mathematics and the understanding of that. Have you got any tips of kind of how do you convince those sort of in the power with the purse strings and everything to properly engage with mathematics in order to then deliver some of these solutions?
Who would like to comment on that? Naira, of course.
Well, okay, yeah, there's a two-part answer to that. I mean, the first is there's a practical, and this is, let's say, an actual experience I had out in industry, where I was working with a director of data science, and he knew all about machine learning apart from the mathematics, and he wanted to apply this machine learning to some problem. And I said, okay, what I'll do is I'll do some statistical test to test the results. And I did the statistical test on the results, and the stats test said it wasn't significant at the 5% level, at the 10% level, at the 20% level. And he turned around to me and he says, well, this statistical test, who did this statistical test? Who invented it? And I said, oh, some German mathematician called Gauss. And he said, oh, that mathematician got it wrong then. I thought, oh my word, so just to say that just shows how important is to know the underlying mathematics, to know that we're actually using the algorithms, and the algorithms are performing. And then my second part of the question, I'm going to say this, just tell people that mathematics is indisputably the greatest subject in the whole wide world, and that will solve the problem. Okay.
Okay. How can we beat that, Hannah? Unless you're going to greatest subject.
I mean, I don't think I ever can. Like saying the gas is wrong is, that's quite the Dunning-Kruger, isn't it? So I think, ultimately, I think partly it's a matter of time, really. There's a brilliant book by Azim Azar called The Exponential Gap. And essentially it says that the world is going in this direction. that have no choice about it. Basically, we're on an unstoppable train towards data science being more and more important. And you can choose to carry on this sort of linear trajectory of society, but the gap between where people are now with their current level of understanding and where they need to be is only increasing as time goes on. And you can see this by all-powerful companies, that the all-powerful companies are the ones that have really understood this change and got behind it early. And I think that ultimately, I think the only reason why people, really get behind stuff is often motivated by their personal fear of being left out. And I just think that actually this is something that politicians do need to worry about. I think as time goes on, I don't think that they're going to have a choice but to engage with these ideas.
You're absolutely right. And that was one of the reasons that another group that I chair is the All-Party Group for AI, together with Tim Clement-Jones in the Lords, to try and make sure that there is sort of a way of feeding that into the powers that be. So thank you for that. I'm going to try and get 2 more questions in because the clock is ticking. But the first one is from John McWhirter. John. Welcome.
Unmuted, can you hear me?
We can hear you. Please fire away.
You're referring to my question to Naira?
Yes, if you, I have a list of people who have submitted a question, so please fire away.
Well, I was really, in a sense, challenging the point.
Oh, you've gone mute again, John. That's it. Challenging the point.
Questioning the point about a bad model being one which predicts and then you execute it. And there are many examples in modern life, from digital communications to GPS receivers, etc., which use precisely models like that. I'm thinking of the Kalman filter. So it seems that it's possibly just a little bit simplistic to say that. I see Nara has answered that question here on the Q&A session.
Okay.
Which is quite good. I also made a point, which is worth emphasizing here. I think we've had 4 great talks. Thanks to all the speakers. Wouldn't it be great if all parliamentary discussion was so objective? Thanks.
I think that's probably, I won't ask anyone else to comment on that. I think that's probably aimed at myself and soon to be Steve, and we try our best. It's interesting, if you follow some of the debates on a quiet Thursday afternoon, they're often far more consensual than the set pieces that one might see at Prime Minister's question, where it is a battle of ideas, where the ideas are quite disparate and teams back their own side in that. But there is quite a lot of high quality debate that takes place here as well. I think we've got 3 minutes, so I'm going to give the last question to James Barlow. James.
Hello. So I should clarify, I'm a maths educator. I'm a secondary maths teacher, not a scientist or a mathematician. My question was in relation to the UK government's response to the COVID outbreak, because of course there was a quite involved pandemic preparedness plan in place prior to COVID. Obviously that was based on assumptions around influenza. And I'm curious to know whether it's possible, to apply some hindsight and say, well, what would have happened if they'd followed that original plan? Would things have turned out dreadfully differently? Would things have been much the same as they are now? I say this as also as having a sideline in audiobook production. I narrate and produce audiobooks, and I had the peculiar experience of producing an audiobook version of Coronavirus, the British government's action plan, to find out that it was obsolete one day after it was published.
Okay, thank you, James. Kit, do you want to go first on that?
Yeah, so I'll say that a lot of the modelling around the pandemic, at least the Imperial College modelling, was, and I think Ellen touched on this as well, was repurposed from influenza modelling. I think the most likely thing that we thought was going to happen before the pandemic was that we would see an influenza pandemic. That said, a lot of that doesn't mean those models just get thrown out of the window. They can be repurposed relatively easily and tweaked to make them work for a different type of virus. The problem is that we need data on this new type of virus or this new threat. And at the start of an epidemic, it's incredibly difficult to get hold of that data accurately and to validate that data. So that's really difficult. More generally, in terms of preparedness, and this doesn't really speak to mathematical modeling, but there were pandemic preparedness exercises, and some of the recommendations of those exercises were not heeded. They were ignored. For example, we did not have enough ventilators at the start of the pandemic, and that was one of the main recommendations of Exercise Cygnus back in 2016. So we could have been better prepared. I think coming out of this pandemic, we need to learn all of the lessons that we've seen with things that have gone wrong, the reasons why we maybe didn't lock down early enough. You know, we've had a significantly, extremely high death toll here in the UK, and I think we need to learn the lessons from that to try to avoid that from happening again in the future.
Thank you. In the modelling, bear in mind that we are now in the third and/or fourth wave, depending on how you assess them. Would have locking down a week earlier have actually made any difference in the overall number of cases and deaths? It might have done in that first wave, but would that not have caught up at some later point? Yes, sorry, Kit, yeah.
So it absolutely would have made a huge difference in the first wave. It's pretty uncontroversial to say that we would have saved 20, maybe 30,000 lives. You know, cases were doubling every 3.5 days in the lead up to that, which means they were quadrupling in a week. So if you lock down a week earlier, you go in with a quarter of the cases, and that roughly translates to a quarter of death. That's all back of the envelope sort of. Don't take that too seriously, but you were talking about tens of thousands of lives, and Neil Ferguson's come out and said that. Of course, what happens next depends very much on policy, and arguably we should have taken evasive action much earlier than we did in the second wave to save lives then as well. The point, I guess, at the time was we didn't know that we were going to have effective vaccines, but certainly in the second wave, we knew we had these vaccines which were coming online and were going to make a big difference in terms of saving lives. So at that second wave, it almost seems a little bit callous that we didn't act a bit sooner and save those lives when we could have done, and then made sure we implemented the vaccine program. And then, yeah, it's not inevitable that we would have ended up with the same 150,000 death toll that we have eventually. So I think, yeah, the vaccinations are a game changer, but of course we didn't know we would have those at the very start of the pandemic.
Okay, thank you. If, with your indulgence, can I just take one last question, which is from Martine Barons, and if we can keep the question brief and the answers brief, and then I will wrap up, if that's okay.
Thank you very much. So this was a question which came to mind when Kit was speaking, but actually is relevant to all of the speakers, and particularly speaks to Hannah's point that we want mathematics to be for people and not done to them. Do you think that there should be a standard declaration of maybe 10 items that goes along with every mathematical model? It strikes me that it's very difficult for people to learn a lot of mathematics, but if they had the same 10 or 12 pieces of information that went along with every model, that would help them to assess how reliable it is and what it's reliable for. Do you think that sort of a program might help?
Who would like to tackle that one? Hannah.
One of the things that I think has been really effective well, it was around before, but has started to be published with the SAGE documents, is a really clear definition of terms that get thrown around, right? So people say things like, oh, highly likely, oh, it's, you know, it's not very likely at all. And now there is literally a graph which says exactly what each of those words means in terms of probability. It turns it into something that is testable and that later on you can validate it. How many of your highly likely predictions ended up coming to pass? And I think that steps like that really make a difference at making this stuff absolutely clear. I'm not sure what the 10 would be, but I would definitely be in favor of much more thought about the communication of these models to non-experts to really ensure that everybody is having a conversation at the same level. I would definitely be in favor of that.
Thank you. And, Ellen.
I'm in favour of it generally, although I do think it is quite a challenge to do it, because if you think of very complex models, I mean, for example, if you had an individual based model with every person in the UK represented, it would be quite difficult to list all the assumptions that went into those models. I think you could think of a scenario where you have the kind of a few top assumptions, but I think it is difficult to have to publish it alongside a model all that. It should be in the scientific paper, and the code needs to be available. I think having a kind of open code is the way that it's going to be done, because you can really scrutinize line by line every assumption that goes in there. I think listing it in words is going to be difficult.
Brilliant. Thank you all very much indeed. I think I'm going to have to draw things to a close, which is sad because there are still quite a lot of questions, but I think that is just an indication of how interesting people have found this evening's discussion. To my mind, absolutely fantastic. We've covered an awful lot of ground, explored different aspects of the subject, and I think there are some challenges that we can take away as well, and perhaps come up with some action points. So thank you all very much indeed for your contribution. Of course, thank you to our participants, to Naira, to Kit, to Ellen, and to Hannah, to everyone who's attended, and for your questions, and of course to the IMA, and particularly to David Uden and his colleagues for helping us to facilitate this discussion. It's been fantastic. And of course, finally, my big thank you to my team, to Karen and to John, to Alfie Hoare, to Ben. Alfie's going to write up the notes of this, and of course to Lee Jeffs and my substitute chair for a while, Viscount Stansgate. So thank you all very much for facilitating this evening. Our next meeting is on Tuesday, the 12th of October, same timings, 5:30 to 7, when the subject will be brain gain. How would world-leading UK neuroscience research, or how neuroscience research can meet tomorrow's societorial challenges? And that's being organised in partnership with the British Neurological Association. I hope to see many of you then. Until then, have a great month. Thank you all again for making this a fascinating evening, and I will see you next time. Cheerio.